The sky over the Atlantic was a brutal canvas of black clouds and distant lightning, the kind that makes your skin prickle like something unseen is watching. It's funny, really, how most of us think of the Bermuda Triangle as some carnival attraction, something people talk about in bars over beers, laughing at the myths. But when you're out here, with nothing but the groaning of your own ship and the endless churn of dark water beneath you, it's hard to keep laughing. We were treasure hunters, yes, but not fools. We had the maps, the coordinates, the old military records from 1945 when those 5 planes vanished like smoke. Flight 19, they called it. Planes that went out on a training run and never returned. And the weird part? The rescue plane that went looking for them vanished too, one by one. They were swallowed by the Atlantic like something had reached up and dragged them under. Still, here we were, looking for wreckage, hoping to find pieces of those planes, maybe a stash of military gear that would fetch a small fortune. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, just a bit of stormy weather to push through. Hell, we were adventurers. We lived for this. But now, as the wind howled and the waves slapped against the hull, I could feel it. The weight, the sense that something was wrong. Like the triangle itself had its own pulse, its own breath, and we were moving deeper into its mouth. We anchored the ship in the exact spot where Flight 19 had last been heard from. Coordinates locked. Depth charges ready to be deployed in case the wreckage was on the ocean floor. The plan was simple. Deploy the sonar, follow any signals, and dive if needed. Easy money. But as I stood on deck listening to the crackle of the radio, dead static, it felt anything but easy. That's when we saw it. No one spoke at first, because we all thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe the storm playing with our eyes. But there, hovering above the water, no more than half a mile out, was a plane. Its body was rusted, wings broken, and its propellers were motionless. But it was there, floating. Not crashing, not sinking, but hovering like some kind of ghost. My breath hitched in my throat. The others scrambled to the edge of the boat, hands gripping the rail, eyes wide. "Jesus Christ," one of them whispered, but I felt a chill snake up my spine. We all knew what it was, even before anyone spoke the words. One of the planes, one of the missing planes from Flight 19. It was impossible. And yet, there it was. The storm seemed to still for a moment, as if the triangle was holding its breath, waiting for us to do something. Anything. And then, as if the plane sensed our presence, its lights flickered, dim, yellow, and weak, and it started to move toward us. "Turn the boat around," I ordered. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. We needed to leave. Whatever we were seeing wasn't natural, wasn't right. But the others didn't move. They were frozen, eyes locked on the plane. The radio hissed again, louder this time, the static filled with whispers, frantic, garbled voices like a tape playing in reverse. I grabbed the receiver, yanking it to my ear, but there was nothing coherent, just that awful, panicked noise. And beneath it, a faint scream, one that made my blood run cold. The plane was almost on us now, its lights flickering faster. And then I saw them, figures, silhouettes in the cockpit. They weren't moving like people should. Their limbs were stiff, jerky, and I swear I saw something hanging off their faces, something dripping and wet. A loud crack split the air, and the boat lurched violently to one side. The waves grew angrier, slamming against the ship with the force of a freight train. I stumbled, fell to my knees, and in that moment I saw it. The water. It wasn't just water anymore. It was rising, forming shapes, twisted human shapes, but wrong. Their mouths were open, gaping like they were screaming, but no sound came. Just the roar of the storm and the rapid thump of my heart. I could hear the others screaming now, but not from the boat. No, from the water. Then the plane, it passed right through us. I felt the cold grip of something touch my shoulder, and my vision blurred. The ship spun, the waves pulling it down into the depths. And I knew in that moment we were no longer in the Atlantic. The triangle had taken us somewhere else, somewhere we weren't supposed to go. Then I saw them, the faces, twisted, hollow-eyed men from another time. They reached up from the water, their mouths stretching wider, and as they did, I heard their voices in my head. "Join us!" Asterisk. And that's when I screamed, but it was already too late. The sound of my scream echoed in my ears long after it left my throat, swallowed by the wind and the crashing waves. But the ship didn't sink, not yet. Somehow we were still afloat, though it felt more like we were being carried, pulled by something unseen beneath the surface. Something cold and hungry. I scrambled to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribs as I searched for the others. They were still on deck, but they weren't moving. They just stood there, eyes wide, staring at the water as if entranced by whatever lurked beneath the dark surface. Their mouths hung open, silent and slack, like the life had been sucked out of them. It was as if the thing that touched me when the plane passed through us had gotten to them first. I called out their names, but no one answered. Not a single twitch, not a blink. They were frozen in place, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the ghostly plane had disappeared. And that's when I noticed the fog. It rolled in fast, faster than any fog I'd ever seen, thick and heavy like a blanket made of ash and smoke. It surrounded us, swallowing the ship and cutting off everything. No horizon, no ocean, no sky. Just us, trapped in a cocoon of gray nothingness. The ship creaked, groaning like an old man in pain, as if it knew what was coming. I turned back to the crew, desperate now. I grabbed the closest one, shaking him hard, but he didn't react. His skin was cold, too cold, and his lips had started to turn blue. I stepped back, horrified. He looked like he had been dead for hours. But just minutes ago, he had been alive, standing beside me, laughing at the absurdity of chasing ghosts in the Bermuda Triangle. Now he was one of them. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog seemed to press in on me, suffocating, filling my lungs with damp, icy air. The others, God, the others were just like him. Every last one, frozen, dead, staring. And then they started to move. It wasn't a natural movement, not like someone waking up or shaking off a daze. No, this was wrong. Their heads jerked, their limbs twitched in odd, unnatural ways, like marionettes controlled by a clumsy hand. One of them turned to face me, his eyes wide and empty, the pupils blown out as if something inside had snapped. He smiled. The smile was slow, stretching his face far too wide, the skin cracking at the corners of his mouth. Blood oozed out, black and thick, dripping down his chin in fat, lazy drops. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a rope, and I went down hard, the taste of salt and fear flooding my mouth. That's when I heard the sound. At first I thought it was the creaking of the ship, but no, it was something else. Something more human. A wet, slurping noise, like meat being torn from bone, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was coming from below deck, from the engine room. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay on deck, to wait, to hope that this was some twisted nightmare I would wake from. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever was happening, whatever had taken the others, it had started below. My legs shook as I moved toward the hatch, each step heavier than the last. The air felt thick, clinging to me like oil, making it hard to breathe. The slurping grew louder as I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the narrow hallway. The smell hit me first, something foul and rotting like decaying meat left out in the sun. I reached the engine room door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. I hesitated, fear clawing at my chest. But then the door creaked open on its own, and I saw it. The engine room was drenched in blood. Thick, dark pools of it covered the floor, splattering the walls and ceiling as if something had exploded from within. In the center of the room, something moved. A shadow crouched low to the ground, hunched over a pile of what I could only assume had once been one of the crew. The noise, the sickening wet tearing came from it. I couldn't see its face. I didn't want to, but I had to. I took a step forward, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and the thing stopped. The tearing stopped. Slowly it rose, turning toward me, its eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't human. They couldn't be. They were too big, too black, like the void itself, and they locked onto me with a hunger I could feel deep in my bones. Its mouth opened, wide and unnatural, splitting its face like a grotesque grin. Teeth, rows of them, jagged and sharp, glinted in the dim light. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then it spoke, not in words. No, the sound that came out of its throat was like the howling of the storm, the static of the radio. It was a scream and a laugh all at once, and it ripped through me, leaving nothing but cold terror in its wake. I bolted for the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, my lungs burning with every ragged breath. Behind me, I could hear it. The scraping of claws on metal, the wet slap of something dragging itself after me. I reached the deck, slamming the hatch behind me, but it didn't matter. The ship was no longer ours, and I knew, as the fog thickened and the air grew colder, that we were no longer in this world. The Bermuda Triangle hadn't just taken us somewhere else. It had brought something back with us, and now there was no escape. I ran until my legs screamed in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a living thing, twisting and creaking around me, as if it were being consumed by the same nightmare that had taken the others. The fog had thickened, swirling like a vortex, and I could feel that pull again, the strange gravity, dragging me back toward the rift. But this time, something was different. A flash of light, a brilliant, blinding pulse, split the fog for just a moment, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest as the light grew stronger, cutting through the darkness, illuminating the deck in stark white clarity. For the first time, I could see the full horror of what was happening. The figures, the twisted, pale things, were swarming the ship now, their long, spindly limbs reaching out, pulling at anything living they could find. But the light, it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from the sky. I looked up, shielding my eyes, and saw it. A beam of light piercing through the fog, bright and pure. It bathed the deck in its glow, and I could feel something shift. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, and the eerie hum that had been vibrating through my bones began to fade. The light wasn't just breaking through the fog. It was pushing it back, as if the very presence of the light was banishing whatever dark force had claimed this place. I wasn't alone. Through the beam, I saw something, or rather, someone. Figures standing tall human silhouettes, their faces obscured by the brilliance of the light. They were moving toward the ship, and I could hear their voices low and steady, chanting in a language I didn't understand, but somehow recognized. It was ancient, soothing, a sound that cut through the terror like a knife through butter. The rift in the water, the horrible tear that had opened this nightmare, was shrinking. Slowly, the figures from the darkness clawed at the edges, screeching as they were dragged back into the void. One by one, they vanished, their grotesque forms twisting and writhing as the light pulled them back into whatever hell they had come from. The dead crew, the ones who had been possessed by the triangle's grip, fell to the deck, their bodies limp and lifeless once more. But this time, they were truly at rest. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a warm, solid grip that grounded me in the moment. I turned and saw one of the figures from the light. His face was calm, serene even, and he nodded toward the sky. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice low and comforting. "You've been given a second chance. This place, it doesn't belong to you." I blinked, struggling to understand. Who are you?" He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "We are the ones who guard the veil. You ventured too far, but your heart, it wasn't consumed. You still have time." The fog was dissipating now, swirling away like smoke caught in a breeze. The ship, which had been groaning and cracking under the weight of whatever malevolent force had seized it, was stabilizing. The waters beneath us were calm once more, gently lapping against the hull as the light grew even stronger. I looked around, dazed as the figures continued their chant, their voices rising in unison. The last of the shadowy creatures was gone, sucked back into the rift, which had shrunk to nothing more than a thin scar on the surface of the water. And then with one final flash, the rift closed. Gone, as if it had never existed. The light began to fade, and I was left standing on the deck, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The others, the crew, they were gone, but they were at peace now. Whatever had taken them was gone, banished by the light and the mysterious figures who had come to our rescue. The sky above us cleared, revealing a brilliant starry night. The air was fresh, cool, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. I turned to the figure who had spoken to me. He was still there, watching me with those calm, steady eyes. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up at the stars, his expression soft. "You go home. The triangle isn't meant for you, it never was. But sometimes it calls to those who seek too much. You're lucky, though. You'll make it out." I felt a lump form in my throat, a wave of relief and grief washing over me all at once. "And the others? The planes, the ships? Flight 19? He shook his head. "They were lost long before you arrived. Some things can't be undone, but you've been given a gift. Don't waste it." With that, the figure turned, his form dissolving into the night, the last traces of the light disappearing with him. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the stars, feeling the gentle sway of the ship beneath me. The radio crackled to life behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I rushed over, grabbing the receiver with trembling hands. Static filled the air, but through it I heard a voice, a familiar voice, one I hadn't heard in hours. "This is Coast Guard Station 25. We've got you on radar. Hold tight, we're coming in for rescue." I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face. I was alive. The nightmare was over. And as I stared out at the calm, endless ocean, I knew that I had been spared something far worse than death. I had been spared the Bermuda Triangle's grip, and I would never come back.